Imperial Star Destroyer, from Star Wars to the real world. How is it possible and what will come of this? Today, we will answer these questions, as well as consider realism such a ship using the example of the Imperial-class Star Destroyer, the design of which is described in detail in another video on the channel. We will also touch on other ships from Star Wars and more. On the scroll bar, we get closer to the first chapter. Fasten your seatbelts and subscribe to the channel. Nordy is with you, and we are starting. First, let's consider the fundamental possibility of the Star Destroyer from Star Wars existing in an unchanged form in our universe, according to the laws of physics. Let's start with the hyperdrive. Since this is one of the main components in the design of a ship, and without it, any large ship in the galaxy far, far away becomes almost meaningless. As we know, humanity has been actively thinking for a long time, more than 50 years, about the idea of a device capable of covering distances of many light years in an acceptable time. And it not only thinks, but also tries to implement it. No, not in practice, but in theory. At the moment, the most realistic concept for such a unit is warp drive technology, the development history of which goes back 30 years this year. However, despite some advances in theoretical physics, warp drive is still just a concept, bordering on science fiction. At least the possibility of its existence is allowed. Moreover, even if humanity is able to build a working instance of a warp engine, its power will clearly not be enough to move such a massive object like a Star Destroyer through space. Even for Venator or Victory-class, whose length is 1.5 times less than that of Imperial. Thus, at the moment, hyperdrive technology for terrestrial science appears to be decisively impossible in our universe. But what about conventional engines? The vast majority of Star Wars ships have ion engines. The Imperial-class Star Destroyer has 3 main and 4 maneuvering ion engines. And with this technology, everything is much more interesting. Ion engines belong to a subclass of electrostatic rocket engines, which in turn belong to the class of electric engines. That is, the ion engine is just one representative of a whole family of engines. As their name implies, ion engines work using the principle of repulsion between particles of the same charge. Let's briefly consider the essence of their work. Many different substances are used as fuel, but most often it is gas. Xenon. Gas is ionized by various methods. Most often, this is electronic bombardment. Positively charged ionic substances fly out of the nozzle at a very high speed, due to which thrust is created that sets the spacecraft in motion. This is a very simplified explanation. In parallel with this, several other important processes occur, but they do not affect the essence, and we will not consider them. The most important thing is that such engines are quite real not only in theory, but also in practice. And more, they have been widely used in the space industry for 50 years. First of all, the main advantage of such engines is the highest specific impulse among all modern engines. And also, high efficiency, 80%. But such engines also have a significant drawback: very little thrust compared to conventional jet engines. However, with further development of technology, it may be possible to create ion engines whose power will be similar to the engines of Star Destroyers from the movie's universe. Thus, the Imperial engines are quite real, and are capable of existing in our universe. It is also worth mentioning that in the Star Wars universe there are restrictions on the maximum speed of ships in space, such as the physics of the galaxy far, far away. As you yourself understand perfectly well, in our universe there are simply no such restrictions. More precisely, there is a limit on the speed of light. But firstly, it is the same for all physical objects in the universe that have mass. And secondly, you still need to accelerate to such a high speed. However, in theory, Imperial's powerful engines are capable of approaching near light speed quite quickly. In general, in our world, Star Destroyers would not have the same speed restrictions as in their native universe. By the way, the speed of the Venator-class Star Destroyer in the atmosphere is 975 km per hour, the speed of modern airliners. Also in our universe there can be, and even already exist, repulsors. In Star Wars, repulsors are used by almost all types of military and civilian equipment, both ground and space. Ships use repulsors primarily to maintain such massive machines in the atmosphere and to achieve a soft landing. Naturally, if the ship is intended for landing. For example, Imperial was developed without the ability to land on a planet. The Venator, or even more so, the Acclimator, which is a landing ship, has such an opportunity. The repulsors of all these ships are located in large numbers along the edges of the hull, to evenly distribute the load, and to avoid a situation where the ship simply breaks under the force of gravity due to the incorrect configuration of the anti-gravs. By the way, in general, it is not correct to call repulsors anti-gravs, since they do not affect gravity. If you have watched other videos about the realism of certain Star Wars vehicles, for example the video about the LAAT gunship, then you know how repulsors work. This technology is based on Newton's third law and ionization of the environment through electrical interaction. In our case, the repulsor grids, through which current flows, ionize the air under the ship, and charged gas particles fly down from the ship at very high speed. This creates lifting force. And as you may already know, this technology is being actively developed and is already being used to create ion drones. For example, Silent Ventus drone. A little more detail is described in the video about the AAT tank and the LAAT gunship in the corresponding chapters. Thus, repulsor technology is quite possible. But do not forget that in order to operate such powerful repulsors and engines that drive and hold gigantic ships in the atmosphere, you will need an extremely powerful power plant, an energy supply system. That is, the ship's reactors and batteries, as well as related systems. And all this raises big questions, as it is known that the Star Destroyers have hypermaterial reactors that produce an unprecedentedly large amount of energy compared with our civilization. For example, the total power of all 3 Venator-class Star Destroyer reactors is 3.6 yottawatt, 3.6 per 10 to 24 degrees watt. The power of a small and weak star. To understand how much this is, the total radiation power of our Sun is estimated at 382.7 yottawatt, and the total power of all Earth's nuclear power plants is 390 gigawatts. That is, at full power, the Venator reactor generated energy only 106 times less than the Sun, and almost 1 trillion times more than our civilization. First of all, such prohibitively high performance of the reactors of Star Wars ships is due to the use of so-called hypermatter as fuel, a substance that simply does not exist in our universe. More precisely, it is not known to modern science, and there are no theoretical grounds for its existence. However, the closest analog of hypermatter may be antimatter, the existence of which has been scientifically confirmed, in contrast to dark matter, another potential analog of hypermatter. Back in 1965, the first artificially induced formation of antimatter atoms occurred. In theory, it is precisely when using such fuel, or rather when antimatter interacts with matter in a 1-to-1 ratio and in a relatively small amount, that the necessary amount of energy will be released for the operation of kilometer-long space combat ships. It can also be assumed that the hypermatter from the Star Wars universe is precisely antimatter, but this is unlikely, since in the galaxy far, far away, hypermatter can be found in its natural form. That is, without the direct intervention of intelligent beings. For example, in the Redhern star system, the formation of hypermatter was a product of the interaction of the planetary core and the radiation emitted by the star. One way or another, we can equate hypermatter with antimatter and conclude that Star Destroyer reactors are real from a physics point of view. Another thing is that due to improper use during the interaction of matter with antimatter, such an amount of energy can be released that will lead to an explosion and simply destroy the ship. But for this purpose, there are appropriate protection systems designed to prevent such a catastrophic incident. In general, we can conclude that the reactors of Star Destroyers in general and Venator or Imperial in particular, although with some assumptions, are real under the conditions of our physical laws and understanding of the universe. In addition to engines and a hyperdrive, such powerful reactors were required for the Star Destroyer's weapons. The main caliber of the Imperial, like most other cruisers and battleships, was turbo-lasers. In particular, heavy turbo-laser guns, XX-9. To understand the degree of realism of this type of weapon, let's look at its technical description. The turbo-laser was the immensely scaled-up version of the blaster and laser cannon. These weapons were generally mounted on rotating turrets, which were commonly installed in banks on capital ships, space stations, and orbital facilities. Some immobile variants, like those housed within defense towers of the city of Isis, were used on the ground. Agrosite, an extremely rare ore that was found only on Korm and Simicadia, was known to greatly enhance a turbolaser's destructive power. Mercanite was also used in the production of heavy turbolasers. The turbolaser was a heavy laser cannon equipped with large banks of capacitors, allowing it to build up and store far more powerful energy bursts than a standard cannon. They also helped power the galvan coils in the barrels of turbolasers. First, a particle beam was generated in the manner standard for blasters and laser cannons. Then power was increased by guiding this laser cannon particle beam through another stream of energized Tibanna gas, besides the one used in generating the initial beam. The extra capacitors in a turbolaser that stored huge amounts of raw energy then contributed to the beam by energizing it further as it moved to the turbolaser's barrel. The resulting beam carried 2 or more times the energy of a standard laser cannon beam. It then passed through a set of galvan coils located in the turbolaser's barrel, further increasing the beam's power and allowing it to pierce the defenses of heavily protected targets. Because these weapons required extra time to build up energy for their powerful blasts, they tended to have a slightly slower rate of fire than their weaker brethren, usually around 1 to 2 seconds, between volleys, depending on the type of turbolaser and its power setting. The risk of overheating was high due to this massive energy buildup, and many turbolaser models were protected with complex cryo systems and a powerful cooling sleeve on the barrel. The principle of operation of turbolasers described above does not contain aspects that make it fundamentally impossible for such weapons to exist in our world. At least, our screenwriter enthusiast thinks so. Yes, this is a very complex device that requires enormous cost to create, but it is still based on technologies and physical laws known to us. The tractor beams of Star Destroyers and other ships are also quite real. They are based on the principle of electromagnetic interaction. The powerful electromagnetic field created by the beam generator attracts or repels the desired object. This technology, albeit in miniature, is already in use today. It's essentially a magnet, a huge, focused magnet. And since Star Destroyers fly mainly in space, that is, in the absence of gravity, the requirements for the power of tractor beams are reduced, which makes them even more realistic. But what now seems impossible is a force shield, which is the main defense of Star Destroyers and other large ships in Star Wars. Allows ships to be under enemy fire without receiving hull damage. In Star Wars, there are 2 main types of shields used by ships: deflector and corpuscular. The deflector shield protects against energy weapons, plasma and laser shots, radiation, and other things. The corpuscular shield protects from physical objects, asteroids, metal shells, shrapnel, and other things, including enemy kamikaze fighters. Also in the galaxy far, far away, force fields of various types are actively used to retain the atmosphere in an open hangar in space, and to create a barrier, for example, in prisons and other protected facilities. By its physical nature, all this is an electromagnetic field. Undoubtedly, research in this direction has been ongoing since the last century, and something has been achieved. For example, the creation of a force gateway based on a plasma window, which will allow physical objects to pass through but will retain the atmosphere. That is, an analog of the force field that is used in ship hangars. The technology was developed and patented back in 1995. But this is never the same protective force field installed on warships in Star Wars. It may take hundreds of years before the invention of full-fledged protective fields. And this is the case if such technology is in principle possible in our world. But even if the very possibility of creating a force field is possible, it is not at all a fact that it will look and even work the way it is shown in the films. In any case, this is a very controversial and interesting aspect of the realism of Star Destroyers. It will be very interesting to hear your opinion on this in the comments. As part of today's analysis, we will focus on the conclusion that for modern science, protective force fields remain fantasy and seem impossible. But what may be quite possible is the usual armor of ships from which the hull of Star Destroyers is made. The exact composition of the alloy from which the battleship's plating is made is unknown. Nevertheless, we can safely say that this is a very strong material, both by the standards of our civilization and by the standards of Star Wars. The armor plates of Star Destroyers are capable of withstanding hits from turbo-laser charges, albeit for a limited time. And even one such charge can melt an ice block with a diameter of 1,000 kilometers. Creating such a strong alloy is an extremely difficult task for modern terrestrial science. Materials known to mankind are unlikely to be suitable, since their strength may not be enough. Nevertheless, the existence of the necessary materials in our universe is quite possible. It is also possible, although unlikely, to create the desired alloy from substances already known to scientists. One way or another, such strong armor is not fundamentally impossible, and it does not contradict the known laws of physics, so that the armor of star destroyers can be considered quite real. The same applies to the materials from which the frame and internal compartments of the ship are made. An important role in the functioning of star destroyers is played by the onboard computer, equipped with advanced artificial intelligence. Imperial's electronic brains perform millions of computational operations every second. They are involved in almost all the activities of the battleship, from the fire control system and calculating hyperjump coordinates to managing the cleaning droids in the galley. For all these operations, the onboard computer is equipped with enormous computing power, and there are no obstacles to the existence of such powerful servers in our reality. The only question that arises here is devices for navigation in hyperspace. The principle of their operation and the source of data is completely unclear. Terrestrial science does not know the appropriate forms of mathematical and physical equations for such calculations. It is also completely unclear how navigation is carried out already during a hyperjump. Here it is worth returning to the previously mentioned warp engine. In the concept of its application, navigation and even movement control is carried out from outside the ship, outside the Alcubierre bubble. That is, navigators are located in normal space at the starting and ending points of the ship's movement. However, the crews of Star Wars ships completely independently control the movement of the vessel and all calculations, which, as you understand, is impossible. Imperial is also equipped with a huge amount of other smart hardware, various scanners and sensor systems that scan ordinary space. In essence, this is the further development of modern earthly technologies. So they are quite real. In general, with the exception of hyperspace navigation devices, the electronic content of star destroyers is quite real. But the ships from the galaxy far, far away have some other very interesting devices, such as gravity generators and inertial compensators. Their role is to slow down ships and create gravity on board the ship, as well as maintaining the structural integrity of the ship so that it does not simply fall apart during a sudden maneuver. The principle of their operation is unclear, and it is not clear whether such units are even possible in our world. So they can safely be assigned the status unreal. We can summarize that in general, the Imperial-class Star Destroyer can exist in our universe, but with a number of restrictions. Namely, the ship will not have a hyperdrive and a deflector shield, which significantly reduces its combat characteristics. It will be possible to forget about flights across the entire galaxy, due to the lack of a hyperdrive. But thanks to powerful ion engines, the Imperial will be able to make interstellar flights at near-light speed. For example, like the Venture Star ship from James Cameron's Avatar movies universe. The lack of deflectors will make the ship much more vulnerable to both weapons and asteroids. The maneuverability of the ship will also be significantly reduced due to the lack of gravitational generators and inertial compensators. But Star Destroyer's weapons will remain the same power, like many other tactical and technical characteristics of the ship. Now let's see if modern humanity can independently build such a ship. How difficult will it be to produce ship modules, and how will they be delivered into space? Naturally, first of all, it will be necessary to build the frame of the ship from numerous openwork structures on which the internal compartments and hull will be mounted. Most likely, due to the lack of our civilization at this stage of development of industrial infrastructure in space, be it orbital factories, shipyards and factories, and mining complexes on asteroids, the construction of the Star Destroyer will proceed as follows. Relatively small modules will be produced on the surface of our planet. Then they will be transported into Earth orbit and into outer space, where the ship will be assembled from individual modules, like a construction set. Naturally, sending many thousands of tons of cargo into space for the modern space industry will cost a lot of money. Because of this, the total price of cargo delivery can exceed several times the cost of building the ship itself. However, this can be solved by the further development of the space industry. Namely, new ways of sending ships and cargo into space. With the help of electromagnetic catapults, which are already being actively developed and may begin to function in the coming decades. This will allow us to reduce the costs of sending everything we need into space by orders of magnitude. In general, it is the high cost of takeoff from the surface of the planet that is currently the key factor holding back truly active space exploration by mankind. One way or another, the cost of transporting finished modules into orbit will be significantly reduced in the next half-century. What will have the best impact on the construction of the Star Destroyer? By the way, why a ship cannot be built on the surface of the planet? Firstly, this is still much easier to do in space due to the lack of gravity. Secondly, if you build and assemble the Imperial entirely on the surface of the planet, then for it to take off, you will need colossally powerful engines and repulsors. In addition, the takeoff of such a massive object from the surface can lead to a powerful earthquake or a number of other natural disasters. Therefore, the most rational thing would be to assemble the ship in high orbit and in space, as is done in Star Wars. Unless, in films, this happens in specially equipped shipyards. In our case, the assembly process will take place in outer space, since the creation of the necessary full-fledged shipyard will cost even more than the ship itself. Of course, if humanity decides to build an entire fleet of space combat ships, such shipyards will be necessary. But for a single Star Destroyer, such construction would be irrational. What about the required amount of material and production capacity? The largest ships of our time do not exceed 500 meters in length, and the length of the Imperial-class Star Destroyer is 1,600 meters. The modern shipbuilding industry launches hundreds of different ships every year, from small yachts to huge container ships and military aircraft carriers. So, in theory, the production capacity of our planet will be enough to build the frame, hull, and modules for the Imperial in a reasonable time. That is, in 6 months, a year. Especially when producing many different modular compartments of a space battleship at the same time. A few more words about the scale of production. Further comparison will be very unscientific and approximate, but still. In general, in size, Imperial is approximately equal to the 20 aircraft carriers of the U.S. Navy Gerald R. Ford. So the approximate cost of building the Imperial can be estimated at least $260 billion. And most likely the final price will be many times higher. Firstly, due to the cost of transporting modules into orbit. Even if using the latest technologies, reducing costs tenfold. Secondly, due to the need for the development and construction of unique systems and equipment, for example, an antimatter reactor, engines that are gigantic by our standards, and so on. Thus, the price of one Imperial-class Star Destroyer can reach approximately $1 trillion. Of course, this is a very rough estimate. To calculate the exact cost of such a project, it is necessary to involve specialists in the relevant fields. But we can still assume that the price tag of one earthly Imperial will be in the trillions of dollars. But let's take a closer look at the possible difficulties in producing the ship's main systems. First of all, let's look at the reactor, because all ship systems depend on it, which simply will not work without power supply. Which is why a formidable military battleship can turn into a useless, very expensive and huge metal piece of pizza, drifting in space. It is the antimatter reactor, and not the weapons or engines, that is the most complex component of a spacecraft. First of all, for a full power supply and operation of a half-kilometer battleship, a huge amount of antimatter is needed. The meeting of 1 gram of antimatter with 1 gram of matter can result in the release of energy in the amount of 180 trillion joules, which is equivalent to 50 gigawatts of power. 50 by 10 to the 9th power. And the Venator-class Star Destroyer reactor has a power of 3.6 by 10 to the 24th watts. Thus, to achieve the maximum power of the Venator reactor, we need approximately 100 million tons of antimatter. As you understand, such an amount of fuel will be orders of magnitude greater than the size of the battleship itself. And here there are two options. Either the authors of the reference books for Star Wars films, to put it mildly, overestimated the power figures of the Venator reactors, which is quite likely, since the Venator can hardly consume so much energy, or a hypermatter reactor is orders of magnitude more powerful than a reactor of similar dimensions and with a similar mass of antimatter fuel. Most likely, both theories are right at once. By the way, according to a 1999 estimate, 1 gram of anti-hydrogen would cost $62 trillion. One way or another, the Star Destroyer of our civilization will require much less energy than ships from the galaxy far, far away. But even so, using antimatter as fuel will not only be unreasonably expensive, but also simply impossible in the near future, due to the too small scale of antimatter production on Earth. In the coming decades, thermonuclear reactors will come into widespread use, the development of which is considered a priority in the energy industry. Fusion reactors use hydrogen isotopes as fuel. Roughly speaking, water. Because of this, their use will be very cheap. The Imperial has space to accommodate a power plant, consisting of several thermonuclear reactors, the total power of which will allow the ship to supply the required amount of energy for life support systems, engines, and weapons. Let me remind you that our Star Destroyer will not have a hyperdrive, which will significantly reduce the ship's energy consumption. Thus, it is thermonuclear reactor blocks that are the most technically feasible way to supply energy to a ship. But this will only be possible in a few decades, when the technology of thermonuclear reactors becomes widespread, whereas now all such installations are experimental. In addition to the direct power plant from the reactors, the battleship's energy supply system consists of numerous energy cells and storage devices, huge 10-meter batteries that accumulate excess energy from the reactor and ensure an uninterrupted supply of weapons in battle when firing at maximum power. Conventional lithium-ion batteries are quite suitable for this role. On the 1.5-kilometer Imperial, there is enough space to place batteries in the required quantity. A very controversial aspect of the Star Destroyer will be its weaponry, turbo laser cannons. These are quite real devices from a physical point of view, and the first models of such weapons are already undergoing field tests, namely experimental laser weapons. The main obstacle to creating full-fledged laser, plasma, and turbo laser guns is the required amount of energy to fire a shot. Requires the power of a full-fledged reactor. But the most interesting thing is that the Star Destroyer will actually have a power plant consisting of several thermonuclear reactors. The dimensions of the batteries of turbo laser guns will allow them to accommodate the necessary systems for converting gas into plasma, creating a powerful electromagnetic field, and cooling, preventing overheating of the guns, and allowing them to fire at high speed. Space, namely vacuum, is the best environment for the use of turbo laser weapons, which in their physical structure are plasma charges. And plasma in dense layers of the atmosphere quickly dissipates, which makes blasters extremely ineffective weapons in a dense environment. In space, concentrated plasmoids will also be dispersible, but the range of effective fire will be much higher than on the surface of atmospheric planets. Tractor beam projectors will also perform best in the absence of gravity in space, making them more efficient. Thus, the Star Destroyer is an excellent object for installing energy weapons on it, thanks to its powerful power supply systems and the large size of the ship, allowing it to install everything necessary. Similarly with ion engines, the power they require will be provided by reactors and related systems, which occupy most of the internal space of the ship. Except that the engines themselves would look different. For maximum efficiency, the nozzles of electric engines would have a small diameter, which increases the specific impulse of the emitted particles. What about the onboard computer and other smart hardware? The Star Destroyer has enough space to accommodate servers with enormous processing power, capable of controlling the ship's automated processes. Artificial intelligence, which is currently being actively developed and is used in this video, will play a significant role in this. Numerous multi-band sensor systems can also be installed on the Imperial in large quantities. The armor and plating of the ship will be made of standard alloys used in astronautics, aluminum alloys. Yes, the development and production of all this will require enormous costs, as well as quite a lot of time to develop the necessary technologies. But nevertheless, this project is quite realistic for implementation in the coming decades, when humanity has the necessary technologies for the relatively cheap and fast delivery of building materials into space and the creation of all the necessary modules, such as the power plant and weapon systems. Thus, we can say that the construction of the Imperial-class Star Destroyer will become possible by the middle of the 21st century, approximately 2050s, 60s. But in addition to the practical possibility of building such a facility, there is also the question of feasibility. In fact, this is precisely what explains why such projects are not implemented and are not seriously considered. As you understand, there is simply no point in building a 1.5-kilometer military spacecraft at the present time, and there will not be until humanity leaves the solar system. And even then, warships are unlikely to exceed a few hundred meters in size. Large sizes are simply irrational. Thus, the construction of the Star Destroyer is only of cultural value, as a symbol of technological development and the power of our civilization, and also as a symbol of stupidity. And now we will take a closer look at the rationality, or rather the irrationality, of the design of Star Destroyers, and the reason why in the future, even with a sufficient level of industrial and scientific development, such ships will not be built. Let's start with the basis of any transport, with engines, or rather, with their configuration and location. Look carefully. All Star Destroyer engines are concentrated at the stern of the ship, and their nozzles are directed against the direction of the starship. One way. In space conditions and the absence of resistance, such engines can only accelerate the ship, and it is completely unclear how the spaceship will slow down and generally maneuver. In the galaxy far, far away, an inertial compensator and engine reverse were used for this. It is not entirely clear how such a reverse works. Probably, in this mode, the engines attract ions that were released earlier to the ship, or they somehow magically influenced quantum fields in a vacuum, which would give the same effect. Thus, the ship would move backwards. In our world, interactions with quantum fields of this kind are similar to warp drive technologies, which we have recognized as unreal. Yes, Star Wars ships have shunting engines. In the Venator, all engines are equipped with a full-fledged deflectable thrust vector, like modern fighters of many armies of the world. But such engines are only auxiliary, and partially solve the problems of maneuvering, while the problem with braking remains the same. If in reality we use the same engine's configuration, then to slow down the ship we will have to make a 180-degree turn around the vertical axis of the ship. That is, the ship will begin to fly stern first, and only in this way will the engines be able to begin braking. As you understand, this is very difficult and involves great risks. That's why no one will build like that. The correct solution would be to place engines in equal numbers at the stern and bow of the ship, as well as along the sides for maneuvering. For example, this is exactly the configuration that is used on the ISS and other space stations and devices. And in science fiction, Star Fury from Babylon 5 had such engines. Another solution would be to create rotatable motors located outside the hull, on structures capable of turning the motors 180 degrees. Essentially, instead of turning the entire ship, only the engines will turn. For example, this is exactly the mechanism used on the already mentioned Venture Star ship from the Avatar cinematic universe. So, we sorted out the engines. The next biggest oddity of almost all Star Wars ships, and especially Star Destroyers, is the Captain's Bridge, located in a hefty superstructure that protrudes significantly from the hull, and which is missing only a neon-lit target with a shoot here arrow. Imperial is almost a record holder in this regard, but even it was surpassed by the Providence-class carrier Star Destroyer. One of these ships was the flagship of the Commander-in-Chief of the Separatist Forces, General Grievous, in the third episode in the battle over Coruscant. These ships had a huge superstructure, which amounted to half the entire height of the ship, with a captain's bridge located on top, which is the height of engineering idiocy. Such a contraption could easily crash into an allied ship. But all these ships have at least an armored captain's bridge. The Munificent-class frigates' bridges can even be penetrated by light fighter guns. This is described in the corresponding detailed video on the channel. In general, the superstructures and captain's bridges of warships in Star Wars are extremely irrational. In reality, the bridge, being a vital control element of the ship, will first be carried deep into the hull, approximately into the center of the ship, under the protection of armor and many compartments with their internal lining, equipment, the ship's frame, and bulkheads. Panoramic sides of the bridges, more reminiscent of observation deck on ships of past eras, may only be appropriate for civil space liners, yachts, and other civilian vessels. In this case, even panoramic bridge windows, reminiscent of those on airships, would be quite appropriate. Speaking of portholes, they will simply not be needed if there are high-tech means of monitoring the environment. All kinds of scanners and sensors, including CCTV cameras. All these external surveillance systems will broadcast an excellent quality picture directly to the captain's bridge, control room, and other compartments of the ship. This will make it possible to get rid of portholes, which, even being made of transparent types of metal that are not inferior to conventional plating in strength, complicate the design of the ship. On a military ship, such excesses may be completely contraindicated, due to a decrease in structural strength and the overall survivability of the ship. In general, the entire design of the ship in reality raises many questions. The iconic wedge-shaped design of the battleship is due to the possibility of creating such a weapon configuration to allow firing from all barrels at once along the ship's heading, which increases the density of fire in a linear battle when ships move head-on. But similar results can be achieved with a different ship design by placing the guns in special sponsons, carriages, and towers that do not overlap each other's sector of fire. Also, a few words about the Imperial's hangar. In general, such a large gate makes sense, allowing corvettes and landing shuttles to enter directly onto the side of the battleship. The presence of a second hangar entrance allows you to avoid overloading the work of the main hangar. Considering the role of the Imperial as a universal combat ship, capable of transporting a division of stormtroopers with reinforcements and an impressive space group, such a hangar is justified. In any ship, the crew plays an important role, about which not a word was said today. In Star Wars, ships have oversized crews. Imperial has a full crew of 36,000, but for the full functioning of the ship, 10,000 sailors and officers are enough. In reality, this number may be 10 times less. Yes, modern aircraft carriers have crews of several thousand people, and their sizes are tens of times smaller than the size of Star Destroyers. But automation and robotization will play an important role here. With developed artificial intelligence and the proper level of robotization, the full crew of the ship can be reduced to even several hundred people. For example, even in Star Wars, most of the ships of the fleet of the Confederacy of Independent System, the enemy of the Galactic Republic, have almost completely robotic crews. That is, there is not a single living creature on board. Among the advantages of this solution is the reduction of the ship's life support systems, which will save valuable internal space and reduce the cost of the ship. It also requires a significantly smaller number of qualified crew members. In general, even if there was everything necessary for the construction of a Star Destroyer, humanity would not have the main thing, the point in building such a ship. Real combat spaceships of similar sizes, if they will exist, will have a completely different design, appearance, and tactical and technical characteristics. By the way, the name Star Destroyer itself was not invented just to intimidate enemies. This class of ship includes ships of different classes, sizes, and purposes, which are united by the main similarity: very powerful weapons. Thanks to which, even one such ship is capable of causing an exterminatus on the planet in a few days, literally erasing all life from its surface. And a squadron of such ships could turn an entire star system into dust. Hence the name. By the way, let's imagine a theoretical situation in which our civilization would receive Imperial. Even then, the ship wouldn't make much sense. Firstly, there is simply no use for it. Secondly, maintaining such a ship will be catastrophically expensive from a financial point of view. And from a technological point of view, repairing the ship will simply be impossible, due to the lack of necessary spare parts and equipment among Earthlings. Thus, to summarize, Star Destroyers from the Star Wars universe are in some aspects fundamentally impossible in our world. However, in simplified form, such ships can still exist in our universe. At best, humanity will be able to start building such a ship in a few decades, but the completed ship will make no sense, due to the extreme impracticality of its design, and the real ships that humanity will build will look completely different. One way or another, the iconic image of the Star Destroyer will remain only the preserve of science fiction.